Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Tatyan, and I'm a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at Urban Institute, as well as research director for Urban Greater DC. I am also the moderator for today's event. Mary Cunningham, the vice president for Metro Center, was to be the moderator today, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Mary cannot be with us, so I'll be stepping into her role. This is the third in the Advancing Racial Equity in Our Communities event series, and I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. A few housekeeping things. First of all, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. Speaker biographies are available online at urban.org. We have enabled live captioning, and if you'd like to adjust those settings, you can do so with the Show Hide Captions button on your Zoom window. All participants are muted today, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we hope to have time to get to many questions at the end of today's webinar. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of this event to give us feedback on the event. And lastly, please engage with us online by using the hashtag #live@urban. So to frame things for our discussion today, urban researchers have long demonstrated that Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color face systematically inequitable access to safe, quality, and affordable housing. And a core part of our work is studying the inequities caused by systemically racist policies that have long affected communities and finding solutions that advance racial equity, build resilience, and bring community members into the process of economic development. This event series was born out of that work and that commitment to advancing evidence-based solutions to really address these inequities. For generations, the laws, regulations, and institutions governing how our built environment and neighborhoods are designed have produced, condoned, and perpetuated widespread unfair treatment of people of color. Racial covenants, zoning, enforced segregation of public space, opaque municipal budgeting processes for new capital projects, these have all been part of that legacy. More recently, the reinvestment of public and private funds into improving housing, jobs, and public space in formerly redlined communities is creating displacement pressures for low-income people and communities of color. So how can we counter the generations-long impact of racism in our cities and neighborhoods and create more equitable approaches moving forward? That's what we hope to discuss today. In this event, we will discuss opportunities to center community priorities during the allocation of city, state, and federal funds, to improve public space, particularly through participatory budgeting, in hopes of challenging past patterns of exclusion. The panel will also examine how local governments and planning agencies can acknowledge historical and present-day disinvestment in Black and Brown communities, leverage data to measure progress in equitable development projects, and funnel new funding opportunities or decision-making power to residents of color. Our panelists this afternoon will explore the opportunities and challenges that lie in the strategy of participatory budgeting. By delving into the work of the Participatory Budgeting Project and the City of Durham's Participatory Budgeting Pilot, we hope to educate all of us on the best ways to move forward in these areas. Additionally, the panelists will touch on lessons we can learn in the field of equitable development from the work of our researchers on infrastructure reuse projects, including the 11th Street Bridge Park and the Purple Line Collaborative. So to start with, I'm honored to introduce my Urban Institute colleague, Sonia Torres Rodriguez, who is a research analyst in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center with me. And she and I are going to give a short research presentation before we introduce the panel. So Sonia.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. And before we get into our excellent discussion on equitable development, I'm going to be providing some background research on why we're here at the Urban Institute thinking about equitable development in our cities and why we think it's such a crucial aspect of our journey towards racial equity. So first, infrastructural racism, i.e. the laws, regulations, and institutions that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment of people of color in the built environment and in our neighborhoods, has created and entrenched disparities in the economy, in wealth building, in housing, education, health, and well-being more broadly. So to make this very concrete, every time we step on a sidewalk, drive on a highway, or go to a park, we're encountering a calculated decision about how infrastructure and land use are to be used. And very frequently, those decisions are the product of infrastructural racism. The solution to this past disinvestment has included new initiatives, new funding, new economic development projects to try to change how this has happened in the past. But as we've seen, sometimes these initiatives themselves perpetuate inequities. We see displacement being driven by some of these projects and driving legacy residents out, or leading to legacy residents, people who've been in a community for a long time, feeling that they don't belong in the community that they grew up anymore, and that they're not benefiting from economic benefits. So here at the Urban Institute, we're interested in equitable development, which presents an opportunity for public and private entities to come together and reimagine the physical, economic, and social infrastructure systems and investments in our communities. This might include revitalizing commercial corridors, improving streetscapes, updating parks and public space, or renovating vacant or derelict housing. All important ideas, but they won't be equitable if marginalized communities, especially those who are currently living in those spaces, don't get to participate in either the decision-making or in reaping any of the associated benefits with these new investments. So when we think about gentrification and displacement, we typically associate it with a lack of affordable housing, and that is certainly an aspect of displacement. We see that there might be a mismatch between employment and housing rental price growth, which drives low-income renters and people of color out of certain neighborhoods. We see, and there's data to back this up, that the demographics of neighborhoods have been changing as a result of these housing prices increases. We know that some of these dynamics are being perpetuated by dynamics in real estate, such as investor buyouts. And also we've seen that the problem is so significant that we've seen a response during the pandemic with new levels of public and private reinvestment to try to address the displacement that we're seeing. But importantly, the impacts of displacement are more than just unaffordable housing that push low-income renters out of their communities. It can also include rising commercial rents, which reduce the diversity and the viability of the small business community in a specific region or other commercial ventures. This in turn reduces the economic productivity in a region. It can force displaced people to move to new neighborhoods where they have to change jobs and schools, which then impacts their job and education outcomes. It can result in the loss of artists and cultural contributors, especially those of communities of color. And it changes the feelings of belonging for Black and Latinx residents who have been in their communities. So our team here at Urban works across some of all of these areas, and I'll pass it over to Peter to discuss some of these projects.
Great, thank you, Sonia, for that great way to kick us off. And Urban has been very privileged to work with partners who are doing groundbreaking work in equitable development, and so I'm happy to highlight some of that work today. The first is one of Urban's longest current partnerships with DC's 11th Street Bridge Park. This is an effort by a DC nonprofit building bridges across the river to build a public park on top of what was a highway bridge spanning the Anacostia River in DC. But the Bridge Park team recognized early on that without a deliberate and robust equitable development plan, a new bridge park might further marginalize or displace some of DC's long-standing populations, particularly the predominantly Black population living on the east side of the river. So they created an equitable development plan that has become a model for similar projects, not just in the US, but in other countries too. And Bridge Park's Equitable Development Plan epitomizes 3 points I'd like to highlight regarding equitable development. The first is partnerships. The current plan highlights work in 4 areas you see here, and Bridge Park understood that it could not accomplish meaningful change in these areas by itself. So they partnered with groups like the Douglas Community Land Trust, the Skyland Workforce Center, Washington Area Community Investment Fund, and local artists to help them achieve their housing, workforce, small business, and arts and culture goals. Second is measurable results, and Urban worked with Bridge Park to help define metrics to track progress on all of these goals, many of which you see here on this slide. And last, and perhaps most important, is involving the community. These priorities for the Equitable Development Plan came out of conversations with the people who live in the neighborhoods near the future Bridge Park, and the ongoing work continues to be informed by community voices. A second partnership is with the Purple Line Collaborative, which is focused on equitable development in communities that will be served by a new light rail line in Prince George's and Montgomery counties in Maryland. So different project, different type of infrastructure, but the same concerns about making sure that the economic benefits of the new light rail support the people and businesses currently in these communities, rather than marginalizing or displacing them. The collaborative includes enterprise community partners, National Housing Trust, and Latino Economic Development Center, who are working to preserve affordable housing and locally owned small businesses in these areas. And again, Urban has worked with this group to help them define and track measurable results of these efforts. And community engagement has also been a key part of this effort, with the partners working with residents and small business owners to provide them with the supports they need to be able to stay and thrive. And lastly, we've taken these experiences and applied them to some tools to help others who are creating equitable development plans of their own. Urban collaborated with the Highline Network and the Harvard Graduate School of Design to create the Communities First Toolkit, which has a series of tools designed to help park organizations address inequities caused by infrastructural racism and shape public spaces that bring social, environmental, and economic benefits to communities. For example, we have a tool on how to create a long-term vision for addressing equity issues. But even though this toolkit was created with park space audiences in mind, many of the tools could be used in other contexts as well. So we've included some links in the chat, and I hope that folks will be able to check out these resources after the webinar. So let me turn it back to Sonia.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. And then framing a little bit of the discussion happening today, which I'm so excited about. Across our equitable development work, we've seen that community ownership has continuously shown up as central for effective programs, strategies, and effective equitable development. Participatory budgeting, which you can see featured on the slide, is one opportunity to consider, because it is an extremely concrete way to apply democratic principles and create opportunities for community ownership in the process and in the outcomes of new capital investment projects. So as shown on the slide, we see that the process for participatory budgeting begins with designing the process, typically with a steering committee of community representatives, brainstorming project ideas with the community residents, developing proposals for community voting, and then funding winning projects through government and institutional funds. We see an increase of participatory budgeting pilots and projects around the US, which is really encouraging. The graphic on this slide is from a recent Urban Institute publication showing increased usage of both federal and local funds for these types of projects. And I won't go into all of these projects, but for example, in Nashville, Tennessee, we saw $2 million allocated in 2022. This money went to new park amenities, improved public facilities, additional bus shelters, and those were some of the winning projects in 2021. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, we also saw a new PB pilot that is trying to determine how to spend about $2 million from their American Rescue Plan Act funds. So there's opportunity to use both federal and local funds. And with that, I'll turn it over to Peter so we can hear more in our discussion today about how we can think about participatory budgeting.
Great, thank you, Sonia. At this time, I'd love to welcome our panelists to join us on camera. We're very excited to have with us today Sherry Davis, who is the co-executive director of the Participatory Budgeting Project, and Andrew Holland, who's assistant budget director for the city of Durham in North Carolina. So thank you both for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to this discussion. Before getting into that, I do want to remind the audience that we are going to be collecting questions throughout, so please feel free at any time to type questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to address as many of your questions as we can at the end of the session. So let me start off with a question I'd like to pose to all three of you. regarding what does equitable development mean to you? So we were going to be using that phrase a lot today, and Sonia talked a little bit about what it means to some of us at Urban, but I'd like to understand from a personal perspective and also related to your work, what does equitable development mean to you? And so let me start with Sherry, if I may.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Peter. It's really excited. I'm really excited to be here. And I love this first kind of opening question. What does equitable development mean to me? And the first thing that comes to mind is building with and not for. It's actually allowing folks that are often at the margins to set the center. That I think is where equity really comes in, when folks that are usually pushed out or excluded historically from shaping the spaces, policies, and places around them are actually put in the driver's seat. And that's what I mean by saying building with and not for, right? I think we've seen a lot of mistakes historically when we're building for certain groups, and equitable development is actually the infrastructure and practice of building with, in my opinion.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, so much. Building with, not for. I think we're going to come back to that phrase again. And love to hear more about that. So Andrew, let me turn to you. What does equitable development mean to you and in the context of your work in the city of Durham?
Yes, absolutely. And just to piggyback off of what Sherry said, and she was spot on with her definition, I would say equitable development really focuses on meeting the needs of marginalized communities through engagement, policy, and programs that ensures that you're creating a vibrant and sustainable environment and a sense of place and belonging. And I would say really the centerpiece of equitable development is equity. And in my opinion, before you can even get to the equitable development piece, you have to have equitable engagement. You have to be intentional on how you go about engaging more of your underserved neighborhoods and residents, because there is a distrust at times when it comes to government, and rightfully so, due to past harm and also ordinance that has adversely impacted underserved communities, specifically people of color. So what we've tried to do in Durham is we've tried to create an environment in which we are intentional, where we meet people where they are. We have pop-up events where we go to bus shelters, we go to African-American churches to engage our residents around participatory budgeting. We're also mindful about the times and days we should engage residents. Typically, we tend to engage residents after work hours, and also over the weekends. We've also ensured that we provide our volunteers with stipends and also provide childcare so that they can go and meet, so that we can go and brainstorm and hear from them. And last but not least, one of the things that we're doing for this cycle is we're incorporating participatory design. So we're in the process of building a relationship with North Carolina State University, their College of Design, and hiring interns, and to leverage those interns to create participatory design labs so that we can go to those communities and to get feedback from the residents to get a better idea of exactly how do these projects really reflect their neighborhood and the culture within the neighborhoods.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Meeting people where they are. So that's, I think, another thing we should all take note of. Sonia, as a researcher at Urban Institute, we have kind of a different perspective. So from where you sit, what does equitable development mean to you in your work?
Definitely. Well, I think it still holds a personal angle for me. As someone who grew up in Puerto Rico and in also Houston, I see the very real impacts of not getting to design or participate in how we think about our communities being built. I think one very poignant example for me was in 2017, when in the same month, Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Maria were flowing through both of my communities at the same time. And a lot of questions of climate resilience really came to this idea of things that community members had wanted for a long time, but had difficulty participating and had their voices listened to so that their communities could be more prepared for climate disasters that we see a lot more today. So I agree with everything that it's been said, and it's so inspiring to think about equitable development as an opportunity to change how our communities have been involved in these processes before. And as a researcher, I think that also applies to how I apply and think about my research, right? So I think that it's not just equitable development with communities. Research should also be with communities. So I think that that's also something that I bring to my work, is thinking about the research questions around equitable development related to either housing, economic opportunity, green space, public space, or even the impact of new investments, so policy evaluation. All of those things, I think the research questions should be drafted with and in partnership with communities, and the analysis should also be done. So that people get to both make decisions about their communities, but get to decide what type of data they get to choose to make those decisions.
Great. Thank you, Sonia. And thank you for sharing some of that personal perspective as well, which is very important for all of us. So let me now have a question for both Andrew and Sherry. And Andrew, you talked a little bit about, how you go about trying to make sure that people do have that opportunity to share their voice. But how have you tried to ensure that you have an equitable representation of voices in your planning processes, making sure that you're hearing from everybody you need to hear from, which I think, can be a challenge, even if you set the table, but getting people to come and participate. And, particularly in the participatory budgeting space, like, how do you go about that?
Yes, great question. And I think it goes back to looking at the data, looking at the research, and also looking at that data to really help guide how you go about engaging certain neighborhoods. One of the things that we've been doing over the past few years is we've been leveraging our neighborhood compass, which is owned by DataWorks, in which we have a contract with them. And that is really a guide to help us to identify those low income areas. Even within that too, we can go and look at the specific neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestments as it relates to capital improvement projects. Also, we leverage other departments within the city. We have our neighborhood improvement services department, which they have done a great job of building relationships throughout the community. They've been doing it for years now. And we leverage those relationships because, again, there is distrust when it comes to residents. And one of the things that we try to do is we try to identify those key stakeholders to really carry the water for us. And one of the things that we try to do is we provide a toolkit so that we empower those individuals to speak on our behalf and to go into their neighborhoods, because they know their neighborhood better than government officials. So we really empower those individuals to go out and to talk about participatory budgeting, and also how participatory budgeting can benefit their communities.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And just you mentioned the neighborhood compass. Just for the audience, could you just say a little bit more about what that is and describe it a little bit? Yes,
neighborhood compass is really a interactive mapping tool which has numerous data sets. You can filter through various data sets, data points. You can go and look at what neighborhoods are experiencing a food desert type of environment. You can look at the median income of particular neighborhoods. You can also go and look at, again, which areas have experienced disinvestments when it comes to capital improvement projects, such as the lack of sidewalks. Also, you can go and look at which of the neighborhoods lack adequate trees, street trees. So it's a very intuitive, interactive tool that is open to the public.
Great, sounds very powerful. I'm sure a lot of people will want to check that out after the call. Sherry, what about from your perspective, how have you seen cities try to ensure and equitable representation of voices in planning process and in participatory budgeting processes particularly.
Well, let me think about ways to kind of add on to what Andrew just shared. I think this is a beautiful example of how this happens. And maybe just to offer a little bit of a zoom out, some of the things that have to happen in order for voices to be heard, and maybe this sounds obvious, is deep listening. One of the challenges that we experience in government, and to be honest, I was a person that worked in government for nearly 15 years. So I have a lot of experience, and I'm recovering maybe from my experience in working in local government. And I say that with like a shout out to folks that do work in local government like Andrew. It's not a place where you often have a lot of tools and infrastructure for deep engagement and for deep listening. And so what Andrew is describing, I think, is incredibly unique for a municipality to have such robust kind of like infrastructure to tap into and build upon. And so I did want to name that piece first. Sometimes we're talking to communities that are really small, or where city staff are incredibly under-resourced, and it can be hard to think about building a process so robust. And so I'm going to back up a little bit just to talk about maybe where to start. And deep listening may sound obvious, and I love that Andrew mentioned some like open source data to understand who and where you need to listen. And so you can get a sense of where investments have been made and maybe some areas that have been divested from or underinvested in. And the part about listening that I keep harping on is when we talk about setting up and designing a process, the processes that are most successful are the ones that incorporate grassroots leadership, lived experience, and recognize that lived experience is expertise, right? It's not me, Sherry Davis, that could parachute into any community across the country and ensure that there's equitable representation. It's actually the people that live there, tapping into their expertise and then leaning on the folks that work in government to offer their technical expertise as well. And I think that when we talk about setting up systems in order for this to happen, it actually comes back to the design of the steering committee. Who is designing the process and making sure that folks have the right role? And so grassroots leaders are actually the folks that should be designing deep engagement so that there can be equity and voice, right? And they tend to have really good feedback around where people are meeting, what barriers they're experiencing, how to address those barriers to allow for full participation. The last thing that I'll say is deep listening isn't free, right? Having people design a process that are individuals that are ambassadors of certain communities that experience barriers themselves should be compensated for their effort and labor in building a successful and robust process. So I say all that to say that equity does require investment. It requires investment in people with the skills, knowledge, and relationships to be able to build a process well. It's not prescribed, and it's not the same in every community.
Great, thank you so much. And yes, I agree, deep listening isn't free. I think we do have to all remember that. And if we want that expertise, we need to make sure that people are compensated for providing that. Sonia, I want to turn to you next and ask, what do you see as the role major infrastructure projects play in creating new opportunities to redefine economic, social, health, and well-being benefits from public space and amenities?
Yeah, thank you. And I think I can just build on the past two answers. This idea of creating the opportunity to listen to residents cannot be understated as the most, I think, impactful thing that can come from these infrastructure projects. I think these projects can play a significant role in turning the tide on racial equity as well. I think this was very highlighted by the pandemic, but there is nothing that affects people more than the ability to choose where and when to live, work, play, and all of this is mitigated by whether they have access to public space, where they can live and have access to that, where they can work, whether they can be small business owners. All of these things are perhaps abstract, but they're very related to the possibilities that can come from an infrastructure project. If it's something like a new park, if it's something like a reused bridge, like with the bridge park, as we've seen before, there's a lot of opportunities that can be brought out of it. But the legacy of a lot of these planning projects and these infrastructure projects is that the benefits and the decisions being made are not from the people in the community. So anyway, I think that it does play a huge opportunity in terms of materially, and then also in the process being able to alter how people interact with their everyday sidewalk, street, building, park that they interact with.
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that's an important point to remember that the systems aren't set up to do that. So we have to really be conscious about making sure we're taking those extra steps to create those opportunities for everyone. Sherry, what primary opportunities do you see for local governments to leverage federal funds, like community development block grant funds, to reinvest in historically disinvested communities, especially through something like participatory budgeting? Like, how can local governments think about using those federal funds that way?
One of the things that I often remind people about participatory budgeting is it's not about identifying new line items or surplus in a budget. Instead, it's about identifying spaces where we can make decisions together. And I think federal funds provide a really great opportunity to make decisions together, and they're usually designated for certain populations. And that's one of the things about CDBG, or community development block grant funding. It's designated to impact some of the most low income residents in a community, typically. And in Oakland, California, for example, there's been some experimentation with using participatory budgeting to allow community members that are some of the most marginalized or disenfranchised people in a community to actually weigh in on how those dollars are spent. And so we've seen some instances in a couple districts in Oakland of federal fund expenditure by community members. One of the other things that's really coming to mind, though, as we talk about federal dollars, is a more recent example with ARPA, right? And as we talk about American Rescue Plan Act funds, one of the things that's been beautiful about that is now there's been at least 10 instances of communities across the country that have either demanded participatory budgeting with ARPA funds, and these are designed around recovery, addressing specific need. And so it kind of allows folks to gather around a topical area, and it becomes much easier to then say, my lived experience says that we need this, or here's how we can engage in a solution together. And I think instances like federal funds and explicitly around ARPA funds is a really important door for us to make decisions together. Maybe the last thing that I'll say that I haven't quite seen yet, but I'm hoping to see more of, is participatory budgeting around funds that are designated for climate change. And I think there's a important federal appetite, right, to see us develop some solutions individually and collectively around being in right relationship with our planet and being in right relationship with each other. And so I see a major opportunity to talk about and invest in climate solutions and behavior change with participatory budgeting. And I hope that's something that we continue to see or begin to see.
Great, thank you, Sherry. Yeah, and no, I think that's quite right. We don't need to wait for a special line item to do this. I think that's a very important point. Andrew, I want to ask you. We may have some folks in local government on the call today, and maybe in city planning departments. And what would you advise them to keep in mind if they're thinking about allocating local funds to participatory budgeting? And maybe another way to put this is, what do you wish you had known earlier about this process?
Oh, wow, great question. I really think it goes back to the whole urban planning profession. Whenever I was in college at East Carolina University, I knew nothing about the profession at all. And the only reason why I was able to major and get my degree in urban planning was it was due to me talking to a friend at a party. and I was undecided, and I actually took a urban planning course and fell in love with the course and ultimately the profession. I would challenge the urban and regional planning profession to really engage the youth when it comes to the profession. This can include working with middle schools, high schools to integrate an urban planning curriculum. In most cases, people only believe that urban planning policies and ordinance only impact parents and aunts and uncles, but they do impact the youth population as well. So I think that's important. Another key point I would like to make is I would challenge the planning profession to really be intentional on recruiting minorities within the profession. Within my program, I believe I was the only African-American male in the entire program, which was quite daunting. However, I was still able to see it through, and it was a great experience. And I know that the East Carolina University Planning Program, they have been intentional in recruiting more minority individuals in the program. But I think that's very important, especially whenever we're talking about engaging these residents around the planning profession. It's very powerful whenever planners who look like these individuals in the community are able to see themselves within those professionals. And I think it's important to do that. So I would say, again, it really starts at the beginning and really challenging the profession to really get up to speed and to really do a better job of recruiting more minority professionals and also engage the youth.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing all that. So we're getting a lot of great questions from the audience. So actually, I'm going to switch over to audience questions in a moment, but let me throw one more question to the panel. Just to say maybe a few words about what do you think are the future opportunities to use state, local, federal funds to center residents in equitable development in cities and neighborhoods? So if you had to kind of name one thing that you see as like a really great opportunity that we should try to take advantage of coming up, what might that be? So Sonia, can I start with you?
Yes, I'm gonna cheat. I kind of have two, but
Okay,
I'll be
no
quick.
problem.
I think the first one is making sure that the pilots that are utilizing these funds are not happening in a vacuum. And I think that they connect with other strong partnerships with philanthropic or private entities. I see some of these questions in the chat, but I think partnerships with CDFIs, park organizations, businesses, art groups, philanthropies, all of these are organizations that might already be thinking about how to do equitable development better in their city. And I think that there's a strong opportunity for collaboration, whether it be in increasing the funding that is actually being directed at some of these initiatives, whether it be advocacy support to change certain zoning or land use policies, capacity building for the resident engaged efforts, like that takes time and capacity and space to be able to hold those places. I think it can be done better with partnerships. I think the second opportunity that we have ahead of us is the ability to use data to hold ourselves accountable for the types of projects that we do. So I think creating metrics or evaluation plans, whatever it is, in collaboration with communities to make sure that the funds that we said we were going to be used are being tracked and that we are understanding the impact that they're having so we can do better next time around.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad we got to work in the data point in there. So thank you for doing that. And near and dear to our hearts at Urban. Andrew, what are your thoughts about what's a key opportunity, future opportunity we should try to seize?
Yeah, I would piggyback off of what Sherry said earlier in regards to funding such as ARPA. That is something, of course, that we received from the city of Durham. I believe we received around $50 million. We actually use our PB Darn blueprint and engaging residents and ensuring that they had opportunity to decide how that $50 million should be used. Also, we're in the middle of our engagement centered around the green infrastructure funds, those federal funds. So we're basically using the same blueprint of going out into those underserved communities and seeking out the feedback and the needs from the community. So I would say really to work with your state, federal delegations, and so that you can have an idea of what are some of those state and federal fundings that will be coming into your city, and determine whether the participatory budgeting blueprint could be applied to those type of funding mechanisms.
Great, thank you. Sherry?
Yeah, Peter, I know your question is like, well, what are the opportunities? And I'm really thinking, I'm trying to get there, but I'm just thinking about the threats, right?
Okay.
I'm thinking about what I think that we can expect in the future that we need to prepare for in order to make these opportunities real opportunities, right? And again, as folks continue to focus on equitable development and define what equity is, I think that we're going to see folks with looser definitions of equity attempt to use processes that are labeled participatory budgeting that may not actually include space for deep engagement. And so I begin to think about what I hope happens in the future so that we can see instances of good and equitable PB and participatory democracy. And I think a big part of that is capacity building. And I think it's capacity building, yes, for government staff, specifically around being able to facilitate community dialogue. It can be really challenging to be put in a position where you're trying to navigate several conversations at once, where folks are identifying challenges and then feel like you're not equipped to actually take that input and have like a productive output, right? To be able to say, I'm hearing what you're saying, and here's how we can take these 4 comments and begin to develop a proposal that we can use to address this issue. That's a skill set, right? In the same way that making decisions together is a skill set. If you're turning to a community that maybe has been locked out, never allowed to engage in decision making, there is some skills, some space, some practice of actual decision making that is required. And if you attempt to run a PB process where, one, government staff hasn't been trained in facilitation or given some support in that, or 2, community members don't have an opportunity to, 1, opt in, and they're not met kind of where they are with the information that they need to participate fully, or with the time and space that they need to participate fully, then you're not going to see a successful PB process. What you will see is something labeled PB that happens very quickly with little engagement, and then decisions are made that might not be the best decisions for community members. And so all of this to say, I think one of the things I really hope to see in the future, and I think we're trending toward with community organizations, grassroots leaders, and especially in the movement space, is this demand for capacity building, in organizations to practice decision-making together. It can be bumpy, and bumpy isn't bad, right? Like when we learn new things, there is a learning curve. And I think we have to start practicing that in more spaces, in our places of business, with our families. And then as we continue to build that capacity in a multitude of spaces, this is about behavior change, right? And so the thing for me is I really hope that we start to think about how we change our behaviors in government and in community so that we can actually make good decisions together, so that we can communicate what we need to make good decisions together, so we can practice communicating our needs. And I don't want to undersell that point. There might be some people listening to this call that have this feeling of like, well, I've asked community members what they need and I didn't get a response, right? And there has to be something that changes about that process. I promise you, there's no community member that doesn't have a need, but they might not have a lot of practice or trust in communicating it. So that's what has to be addressed.
Thank you, Sherry. That's wonderful, and actually leads very nicely into the question I got from, or a couple of questions I've gotten from the audience members relating to building trust and creating that space. So Sarah Minster asks, how do you give communities an equitable seat at the table? And so this idea of leveraging and incorporating lived experience versus the kind of established development experts, leaders, who will also be part of those conversations. How do you make sure that both of those, or that the lived experience gets the proper weight it deserves? And from Catherine Carter, we talked earlier about the mistrust, years of mistrust between residents and government institutions. How do we work to overcome that? Obviously, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but what are the best ways to kind of build that trust that will then lead to that more robust participation? So I'll throw those open to whoever would like to answer. Sherry, looks like you've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I'd like to start. And I don't have every answer, right? I think that is the question that we're all answering together through this work. And that is one of the reasons why we engage in participatory democratic practices and processes. There is one process that comes to mind, though, and it's in LA. It's called LA Repair. And repair is an acronym. I can't remember what every letter means, but one of the letters means reparations. And so part of this process is actually rooted in acknowledgement for communities that have been historically divested from, with a special intention to put them at the center of the design process and to see projects come out of the PB process that address historical and traditional harm, right? And so I bring this example up because I believe it's a beautiful way to, one, acknowledge what has already happened, two, be very clear about the populations that we're inviting in to solve problems and allow them the agency to name and solve those challenges with the brilliance and lived experience that they have. This process is unique because it has a heavy weight on lived experience. I think more PB processes should have that heavy weight on lived experience. And one way that we get there, I believe, is to be really clear about the goals, the desired outcomes from a PB process. So if you are to tell me that a desired outcome is to increase life expectancy for Black and Brown people in Oakland, well, then you couldn't really run a process without Black and Brown people from a variety of ages in Oakland. And that now gives us kind of the teeth and guidance to be intentional about moving toward that outcome. And so my short answer to this is to really think about the goals and shared outcomes that you have for a PB process, because that actually sets the engagement standard and practice for a successful PB process.
Thank you. Yes, Andrew, did you have something to?
Yeah, and amen to what Sherry just said. Again, she's spot on, and I think just to piggyback off of that, I think the beauty of PB is it's not only focused on getting a project, or like Sherry said, it's not about getting a line item within the budget. It's really a tool to better inform, or at least listen to the needs of the residents. And in regards to government, you want to ensure that those individuals know where to access the resources within government. And in Durham, what we've done thus far, and as I alluded to before, is we had several pop-up events throughout the city of Durham, where before, whenever we would do our strategic plan, we would have that typical 6 o'clock evening workshop where we would see the same individuals every year. And we wanted to do something different. So that's why we decided to look at the map to determine where are all of the African American barbershops and beauty salons. And we were able to go and use Neighborhood Compass to really develop our outreach strategy. And what we found out, especially working with residents, also known as budget delegates, whenever they're looking at these projects and developing these projects, what they realize, and whenever they communicate back out to the project submitters, is, hey, if you want to get a speed hump, you don't really have to go through the participatory budgeting process. There's a process already in place within the transportation department that is much quicker than PB, where you don't have to go and wait 3 months of proposal development and another month of voting. You can go and get in contact with the transportation department, and there's a process. In North Carolina, to get a speed hump, you have to get a certain percentage of folks within your neighborhood to sign a petition. Same thing with streetlights. So it's really a way to educate residents on, this is how you access government and this is how you get things done. It's not easy. Equity is not easy. It's difficult. It's extremely difficult because you have to be intentional. And I know I saw a question about engagement fatigue. Yes, that's something that we are experiencing in Durham. And that's why we try to collaborate with other departments that have done engagement so that we can go and retrieve the feedback that they've received from these residents so that we can ensure that there's a feedback loop. And I believe that is really one of the biggest obstacles and barriers whenever you do engagement. We don't do a good job of looping around and letting residents know, what did we do with your information? So that's one of the things that we're trying to do in Durham, to try to figure out so that we aren't constantly going to the same residents asking for stuff and nothing gets done.
Great, thank you both for that. Got a couple of questions that are a bit more practical, I think, in focus. So from Natalie Cole-Fontaine, things like, who's typically allowed to participate in participatory budgeting? For example, people who live in the area, who work in the area, are there certain ages that are allowed to participate? Are there limits on how many people can participate? Do you typically see a wide variety of folks who are interested in participating? And a more specific question about, like, dealing with neighborhoods that are divided or segregated demographically, and trying to do in that context. And let me start with that. I think that there's a lot of questions there, so let me start with those.
I'd love to kick us off on this one and just name a couple of things. So one, no two PB processes are the same, because no two communities are the same. So they're all different. I mentioned that PB can be around a specific topical area. It can be around a geographic region. It can be around a theme. My first introduction to participatory budgeting was actually as a city staff member running the country's first youth-focused PB effort, where young people in the city of Boston between the ages of 12 and 25 were deciding on $1 million of the city's revenue. And the way that this happened was it was restricted to capital projects. This is a thing that you will see often in PB processes, especially in the reality that PB has only existed in the United States for about 13 years. We're starting to see more instances of individuals using participatory budgeting with other sorts of budgets that aren't restricted only to capital. So you're able to see expense funds used through PB, those that have like ongoing costs that are not just like 1 year, one-time investments. And so the short answer is anything could be true in this. In the city of Oakland, for example, there was no minimum voting age. So anyone of any age that could interact with the materials was able to vote and engage in the PB process. In most instances of PB, there is some restriction around the vote. You'll hear that there is a lower voting age between the ages of 14 and 12, typically, for folks to be able to cast their vote in a PB process. You'll also see that compared to local and national elections, there is a broadened opportunity for public participation. So folks that are currently or formerly incarcerated are able to participate. One example that I love to give people is in the city of Vallejo. In their first year of running PB, and this was the first instance of multi-million-dollar citywide participatory budgeting. And this happened in a community that had just come out of bankruptcy, right? So they announced bankruptcy first. There's major distrust in government's ability to manage finances, and now they're running a PB process. 1 in 5 of those people, 20%, were actually not eligible to vote in local and national elections. We see people of color overrepresented in PB processes compared to local and national elections. We see low-income people overrepresented in PB processes compared to local and national elections. One of the goals of PB in Boston in that first year that I mentioned was actually to engage folks that identified as houseless. And at that time, it was one of the only processes where we actually had tracking data, and this was a few years ago, around that sort of category of demographic category. And so we were also able to establish some baseline data in that instance. So I will just say that we are typically seeing folks that aren't at the loudest voices engaging in PB processes. And each one of them can be really, really different. The last thing that I'll just mention that folks may want to check out is I think the city of Denver did a really unique PB process that was both citywide and focused on 3 neighborhoods that were traditionally underinvested in. And so they were able to manage a citywide conversation as well as a conversation in these neighborhoods. And so that kind of really speaks to moving through and speaking honestly about some divisions that I think is really important.
Yes. Andrew, did you?
Yeah, and I will be brief. Here in Durham, especially during the first cycle, City Council allocated $2.4 million. And that $2.4 million was broken out amongst the 3 wards. So each ward received $800,000. What we later found out was this was not an equitable way to allocate funds. And that was a lesson learned. Not blaming City Council because this was our first year. But during the first cycle, as long as you were 13 years and older and you were a resident in Durham, you could you could vote and participate in the process. During our first process, we received over 10,000 votes. In Durham, we have a population of 290,000 residents. So we were very excited about that. But most importantly, we were able to hit key demographics. And again, that's why data is so important, because our engagement was centered around engaging those most underserved neighborhoods. And again, that goes back to leveraging neighborhood compass and data. That's very important. So for PB Cycle 3, what we're focusing on now is looking at those neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestment and are low income. We're going to apply a multiplier whenever it comes to the scoring matrix. So if projects are being proposed in those particular neighborhoods and those neighborhoods are underserved, they will get a ×2 or a ×3 when it comes to scoring, so that our scoring matrix is also equitable as well.
Just one quick addition. I think it is, I think, a really valuable aspect of PB that we have seen it so be more effective at bringing more voices to the table. And I think one additional example is that I think it provides opportunity to bring in undocumented or non-citizen voices to the table who are also critical aspects of our communities. And I think for that reason, for the ability to be more effective at bringing unlistened to voices to the table, I see some questions about, well, where do we get the buy-in from, like, our private folks? Where do we get the buy-in from other people to support these projects? Particularly private, I think, is the where these questions are headed. And I think that would be part of my answer to this, is that I wouldn't build a park that's a multi-million-dollar investment as a public-private partnership that then is unused and is not bringing any value or businesses to the community, when that to me would be a failed investment. So I think that that's part of the value that we need to think about PB, is that because of its ability to be more democratic and be more equitable in how it allows participation from people who are excluded even from traditional voting patterns, that is why I think we would have that additional buy-in, and that's the case that I would make to additional partners.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. And I think that that's a great way to wrap things up. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, and so sorry we didn't get to all the questions the audience had, but I know everyone will join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Sherry, Andrew, and Sonia, for the great insights they shared today. Also want to thank the Urban Events team for their typically excellent job in putting these events together and supporting all of us. So thank you for everybody who joined us today. Again, we will be sharing the recording on our website, but please feel free to watch again or share it with others who'd be interested in this conversation. And we'll see you at our next event. Goodbye.